Yeah, thank you, Sunny, for the nice introduction. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to talk to you about today about neural correlates of formal thought disorder dimensions in psychosis. And I will be presenting actually data that has been, or is, let's say, prepared for publication in the special issue at the Schizophrenia Bulletin that was headed by Sunny and Lena, for instance. And we're very much looking forward for this paper to come out. And you get a preview here because it's not published yet. So let's see. Yep. So if we think about formal thought disorders, I know most of you are very familiar with that, but I still want to kind of give a short introduction. We talk about one of the key symptoms of schizophrenia being like one of the big 8 symptom dimensions in schizophrenia in the disorganized speech dimension here. And it's multidimensional because there's multiple ways of how these symptoms can actually present and how they can aggregate in a single patient. So we typically don't look at one patient seeing just one type of formal thought disorder, but there's multiple different types of formal thought disorder that could appear at the same time or consecutively, but within one subject or within multiple a cohort of subjects. And that's why it's important to think about how we can actually measure formal thought disorder. And one very simple way is just looking at the severity, such as how it's done in rating scales like the thought and language and communication scale, where we just look at people at a dimensional level, whether they have very little or no formal thought disorder or very much formal thought disorder. And of course, as I said, this might be too simple because there's different types of formal thought disorders. So people came up with an dichotomy of positive and negative formal thought disorder. And this could be also looked at, let's say, in a categorical way where we just would have people with some negative formal thought disorder, such as concretism or blocking of thought, or we could look at people with a positive formal thought disorder that have like a lot of steady flow of thoughts, for instance, or multiple loose associations. So this could be a way of looking at it, but again, there's also dimensional ways of appreciating that there's people with very little or no formal thought disorder, some with a lot, that can be expressed in that way, as I try to picture it down here. And then there are some other ways of looking at formal thought disorder. For instance, if we just would envision someone who's either being blocked, that would be one end, the very strong negative formal thought disorder. And on the other hand, you would see on the same dimension of, let's say, like associations, someone with very loose associations. And this is expressed in some of the rating scales where we have the extreme blocking on one end and the extreme excitation of the language performance on the other hand, and in between would be a state of normal language production or normal associations, where we would say there's no aberrant behavior, for instance. So depending on how we actually capture our formal thought disorder symptoms, whether we look at them categorically or dimensionally, and whether we split up these dimensions in different distinct dimensions, we can explore brain behavior associations that will inform about the neural correlates of formal thought disorder. And as everyone knows probably here, there's some brain areas that have been highlighted by multiple studies, for instance, in the left inferior frontal gyrus, but also in the Wernicke area, in the temporal gyrus, and several associated brain areas are suggested to be particularly involved in language processing and the generation and perception of words and thoughts. And there's also a way of looking at it more from a network perspective. And this is something that Lena has summarized very recently, where you would look language function more from at a network level as the interface between like default mode network, salience network, and the central executive network. So different ways of looking at brain behavior associations, and I will just guide you through a couple of findings that we found interesting or we had contributed to in the past. So one is our collaborator Helge Horn from Bern, who has done very early on some studies using cerebral blood flow at rest using arterial spin labeling. And he found that the thought and language communication scale score, so the total, let's say, severity of global form of thought disorder, was correlated to perfusion at rest in Broca and Wernicke's area. So that was kind of striking back then. And there seemed to be a linear relationship, so that people with low perfusion in these areas actually had less or no form of thought disorder. And that was paralleled also by some reductions in the same brain areas, the reductions in gray matter volume and gray matter density. Now, we were able to replicate that finding in a different sample, also using arterial spin labeling in 2017, where we again found that the total severity of form of thought disorder as measured with the TLC was correlated to perfusion in the left superior temporal gyrus. But there's also ways of looking at white matter and the structural connectivity in the brain. And some examples here would be with the Bern psychopathology scale, where we actually apply this dimensional view of the inhibition, the blocking on one end, -3, and the excitation, which would be a very loose association with the +3. On this scale here, and that correlates very nicely with the mean fractional anisotropy within multiple white matter areas that belong to the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, but also to the superior longitudinal fasciculus. So brain white matter tracts that combine the frontal and parietal, also temporal brain areas engaged in language production. So that made a lot of sense. And that was followed up by another study led by Werner Sobeck from Zurich, and he combined data sets from Bern and Basel. And we were able to show that particularly the diffusion values in the inferior frontal occipital fascicle that runs at the, let's say, the lower levels of the brain from anterior to posterior, combining frontal and temporal brain areas, that this is also associated with semantic processing impairments in patients with psychosis. However, the instruments that were used to actually assess the amount or the severity of form of thought disorder were, let's say, limited by just looking at one dimension. Here we go. I also want to highlight a couple of more recent studies, one by Lena, where they clustered people with psychosis based on cortical thinning, based on cortical thickness values at 7 Tesla. And they found there's one group that had very strong cortical thinning in all these areas highlighted here in red and yellow. And this group of patients had particularly impoverished speech, as was demonstrated by clinical ratings, but also by analyzing speech samples, looking at the timing and pauses of the speech production. And similarly, Frederike showed that in a larger sample of more than 1,000 patients, there was an association between gray matter volume and then two distinct dimensions of form of thought disorder when they were looking at disorganization and emptiness. And you can see different patterns, let's say, of associations that are extremely interesting when you try to understand how formal thought disorder would be related to aberrant brain function. We were impressed by the TALT scale, and I think most of you have already become kind of introduced to that by Thilo Kircher and his group, and they constructed a rating scale that allows for assessing not only positive and negative, but also for the objective and subjective nature of formal thought disorder. It's still a clinician-applied rating scale, and it has 30 items, and from 27 of those items, they were able to find 4 factors, one related to objective positive, so that is observable, more production of language expressed as logoria, for instance, or the construction of new words, neologisms. And they also have the subjective positive factor that is related to pressure of thought, something that patients can only communicate about, but we're from the outside are not able to actually see what's going on there. And the same holds true for the negative part, where there's objective negative symptoms for poverty of speech, for instance, or concretism that are readily understood by the observer or rater. And then there's other symptoms that only the patients can talk about them. They can express that they have rumination or rupture of thought, for instance. And that is an interesting framework where you have like 4 different dimensions of formal thought disorder that could appear in one patient, either alone or in combination of different dimensions. So this is something that we wanted to explore in terms of the brain behavior associations. And there is also some association, of course, with the classical rating scales like the TLC, but these the patterns of the correlations demonstrate that the TALT is kind of unique in the way it categorizes and conceptualizes formal thought disorder. So the idea here was to check for associations between TALT and the and multimodal brain imaging, and we thought that the total severity of formal thought disorder would probably correlate with alterations in the cerebral language system, as multiple other studies have shown before. But we further hypothesized that we would find specific alterations for each of the 4 TALT dimensions. So when we think about subjective negative formal thought disorder, we were expecting some signs of frontal inhibition, for instance. Or when we look at the objective negative, we thought that that might be related to frontal brain volume reductions. Where instead the positive subjective formal thought disorder we thought would be related to more perfusion in Broca and Wernicke's areas, and the objective positive, so increased speech production, would probably be related to increased perfusion in Broca. And here's what we did. We combined 2 data sets from 2 ongoing randomized controlled trials in psychosis that added up to 110 patients with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. They had an average age of 36 years. Duration of illness was 11.9, so that's quite a chronic sample here. People had multiple episodes, and they had a mean total score of around 70. And we had to exclude a few patients because they had either outlying data on the TALT or insufficient data quality in terms of the MRI scans, but it added up to 110 that had usable data. We ran them through a 3 Tesla MRI at our site in Bern, where we did a sequence of arterial spin labeling that allows for the quantification of cerebral blood flow at rest. And then we did T1 imaging to get some measures of brain volumes using voxel-based morphometry and also cortical thickness. And in some of the subjects, we were able to acquire DTI, and we will present also data on TBSS. So clusters within the white matter skeleton, and then we also followed up with some specific tractography in some of the tracts that were most of interest in the language system. So here's the scatter plots of the ratings of the TALT dimensions. As you can see, in some of the associations within the patients, there's very little correlations or no correlation. For instance, looking at objective positive and objective negative here on the left, there's no correlation, and there's some correlation between the subjective ratings and also within the positive and within the negative dimensions. So it seems to be 4 different dimensions, but there's still some associations in between. And that's why we decided that when we were exploring the neural correlates of one dimension, that we would always covariate for the severity of all the other 3 dimensions. And within this sample, we couldn't find any difference between those dimensional expressions between the sexes or diagnosis. So when we come to gray matter, we had 110 subjects, as I said. We were looking for the CBF that's always depicted on the left, and then the 2 structural analyses in the middle and in the right. And for the TALT, the total TALT, we saw an increase of cerebral blood flow with those subjects that had higher values on the TALT. So the more the more form of thought disorder patients presented, there was more perfusion, particularly in the cerebellum, but also in the superior frontal gyrus and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex here. And all these analyses were covariate for age, olanzapine equivalence, and the total intracranial volume. For the global TALT severity, there was no association with gray matter density or cortical thickness. But when we look at the objective positive subscale here, we find that there's also a positive association. So there's the more objective positive signs people had, the stronger was the resting state perfusion, particularly in the cerebellum, but also in the thalamus and parahippocampal gyrus here. And this was interestingly paralleled by increased volumes in very similar brain areas. So we're looking at the same cerebellar lobule 6, for instance, but also within the parahippocampal gyrus. So in these areas, there's an increase in perfusion and an increase in volume in the ones that have more objective positive form of thought disorder. When we go to objective negative, there was no perfusion, but we saw an increase in gray matter volume in the ones that had more objective negative form of thought disorder, and that was found in premotor areas, so areas that we could hypothesize are more related to articulation or the planning of speech. And then subjective positive, again, no perfusion, but we saw some nice associations within the left inferior frontal gyrus, where there was correlation both in cortical thickness, but also in gray matter volume. And the gray matter volume associations also extended to premotor areas and the orbital frontal cortex, again, more gray matter volume in those that had more subjective positive form of thought disorder. And in the subjective negative, here's the first inverse correlation where we had reduced gray matter volumes in prefrontal areas in the ones that had more form of thought disorder on the subjective negative level. So this is a quite, let's say, diverse picture where some findings across modalities are parallel, but there's quite a distinct pattern related to the single dimensions. And when we look at the white matter, we see something similar. So there's an association with the total TALT scores in the white matter tracts that are related to language and thought, which is the left superior frontal, superior longitudinal fasciculus that runs from Broca's area to parietal lobe, but also to the superior temporal lobe. And here, patients who had a lot of former thought disorder had reduced fractional anisotropy values in this tract, and the same holds true for the left inferior frontal occipital fasciculus. That is similarly running from frontal to temporal lobes, but on a different level. And when we looked at the TBSS findings, we only found something for the subjective positive domain, and that was related to increased diffusion here in red with the mean diffusivity values, and that is more in areas also of the that are, let's say, closer to Broca's area, white matter areas that are part of the superior longitudinal fascicle, and there's reduced diffusion in the corpus callosum in a similar cluster, let's say, but it's the direction between the diffusion change and the psychopathology is completely the opposite here. Okay, so those are our findings, and then we were interested in whether that holds true if we remove this correction for all the other sub dimensions, because maybe by overcorrecting the whole thing, we lose all the information that could be given by let's say a more broader measure. And when we look at the dimensions here, that is the same associations but without the covariates, we see a very similar picture, a very similar pattern of more perfusion in the objective positive in the cerebellum and in the parahippocampal gyrus. Similar pattern also in gray matter. That same thing here for the objective negative. The cluster sizes differ a little bit. The only difference is for the subjective negative, when there was more cerebral blood flow here, but no association with gray matter volume. Here's the comparison again to the main finding where we had the complete covariates. As you can see, the patterns are very similar. And also for the white matter, there were FA correlations with the subjective positive in the corpus callosum, as we have seen in the more corrected version of the analysis. So we were quite confident that we actually talk about some realistic brain behavior associations here. We were able to replicate previous studies. We find associations in bilateral parts of the language network, also in the cerebellum. That was kind of nice, and thalamus. And we had the distinction between positive and negative form of thought disorder. But the novelty of these findings is that we have multimodal brain imaging sequences, and we were able to demonstrate correlates of subjective form of thought disorder, something that has not been looked at this much in previous studies. And we were able to kind of carve out specific effects of the single TALT dimensions. Now, the limitations here is clearly that the type of statistics that we ran may cover some of the synergistic contributions of single thought disorder symptoms, that the way they aggregate and correlate then in a whole dimension. And we'd also have potential selection bias, because remember, we combined data sets from 2 RCTs. So those are like the super schizophrenia patients that are ready and willing to participate in randomized control trials with TMS for several weeks. So this is not the average patient that we encounter in our clinical everyday business. So where do we take this from here? The idea would be next to study longitudinal changes in brain behavior and also look at the networks that might relate to TALT dimensions. So analyzing the resting state bold data, for instance, looking more at different resting state networks and how they relate to TALT dimensions. If we consider these findings really to be specific for some mechanism in a certain dimension of formal thought disorders, then we could also hypothesize that there are specific risks that make people vulnerable for symptoms of a specific dimension. And if that was true, we could also try to design specific brain stimulation targets that would interfere with pathological network function in some of the subjects, but maybe not all of them. So this could help actually to identify people who could benefit from a specific type of brain stimulation, for instance, to ameliorate the formal thought disorder. Yeah, we're doing something similar currently, looking at communication deficits in psychosis. This is more related to nonverbal communication as we test the combination of brain stimulation and group psychotherapy to improve gestures in psychosis. This is where a lot of data came from this study. And this is maybe one way of how we can apply these ideas to actually improve patients' health and improve their lives. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention and thank my team who've been doing all the diligent work and the funding agencies, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. So I think we agreed with the speakers beforehand that we'll spend a few minutes answering questions related to the specific talks, and then have a longer period at the end where we can discuss general themes. So I see. So if you could please raise your hand, like Lena has done, if you'd like to ask your question, or if you put it in the chat, and I'll read it out for you. So Lena, go ahead.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you, Sebastian. Excellent talk. And I had the privilege to, well, edit the paper, so I had some idea of the content. It's an excellent work. Thanks for presenting it. One question I had is relating to the other domain of your interest, motor disorganization. And when we talk about disorganization, especially in formal thought disorder, we often think of this as a sign. We elicit it as a sign, and all the questionnaires, rating scales are signs. We don't think of it as a subjective component. And TALT brings that subjective dimension to it, and your work suggests that the subjective dimension has a neurobiological grounding in some sense in imaging. Now, my question is, does motor disorganization have a similar subjective component? Does it relate to the subjective component of formal thought disorder? Have you given any thought about this, or is there any data you have that speaks to it?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Well, we typically don't have so much self-report data on motor behavior, and this is something that we should clearly aim at doing and adding, because it might be very interesting. Just from single patients, I know that some people are very concerned about their, let's say, reduced ability to move when they feel they are slower or they're blocked. That is very uncomfortable. But beyond that, I have very little ideas of what people actually feel, and maybe we should start asking them more. And the other thing is that we are currently analyzing this data set also because we were looking for associations between the TALT dimensions and then specific motor phenomena, and there seems to be a very specific associations with some dimensions of catatonia, so also disorganized motor behavior that relates to some of the TALT dimensions.
That's interesting. Thanks for that note, Sebastian. I mean, sometimes I think extreme forms of thought disorder, the mutism is a catatonic sign. There should be a very, strong association between these two. So, yeah, yes. Thanks.
Well, so I was wondering if I was also curious about the inclusion of subjective thought disorder here. I was wondering to what extent you felt like these were really manifestations of speech and language or related disorder, as opposed to like metacognition or insight and social, like, which may also play a role, right, in how you experience or how you form or how you're able to report on your subjective experiences, or perhaps maybe it's not worth distinguishing.
No, I think you're absolutely right. You know, when we look at the subjective reports, we need to consider whether people are able to have, you know, insight and whether they're able to express their thoughts. So could be that particularly the ones that have very strong subjective negative form of thought disorders actually have very strong problems actually expressing what they find. So we probably just catch a few of them. And I'm not sure if maybe the Marburg team has used the TALD in conjunction with some insight assessments, but I'm not aware that, you know, we didn't do it, let's say this, but it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Frederike, do you have any thought or data on that?
We haven't looked at it, but I think it's really interesting. What my expression is when I ask people, where did you feel somehow blocked? Most say no. Only a few people say yes. Also, I know that within the interview, they had thought blocking, and they don't experience it. And I think it's really related to metacognition. And yeah, there's something we can separate, I think.
Laura, I think you, so yeah, thank you both. So moving on to the next question in the interest of time. Laura, you put something in the chat. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, so I put the question in the chat as well. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation. So if I am understanding correctly, it actually sounds like the positive disorganization symptoms result from overactivation of the speech area. And then people who have more of a negative symptoms, it seems like maybe the premotor area to drive the speech is becoming a bottleneck area, and maybe that's getting activated. And then there's the chronic effect of over time overstimulation, perhaps thinning some cortical area. So you mentioned about the TMS treatment. I have not looked at the papers. I don't know exactly, but can TMS be used to treat overstimulation, or should TMS be used more exclusively for activating the depressed area of the brain, such as negative symptoms? Because I have not heard of TMS use for, like, for example, like people who get overactivation. It sounds like when we use it for depression, it seems like to activate certain areas.
Mm-hmm. So that's also a great question. There are different, you know, you can use different protocols of TMS, and there's, as you said, the ones that we use actually to increase neural activity in, let's say, left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in depression. But there's also protocols that allow for reducing neural activity for a certain amount of time. And there are also protocols, for instance, in depression, where you activate the left DLPFC while you reduce neural activity on the right. And in schizophrenia, we just finished one RCT where we actually reduce neural activity in the premotor areas in order to resolve the blocking of patients that are very slow. So, you know, you can have little behavioral output, but a lot of neural activity in terms of a block, and that could be something related to a cortical problem at this very site, or it could be also related to network issues, that maybe the circuitry is more in a primarily inhibited state, let's say, if the basal ganglia are driving the whole thing.
Wow, thank you very much. So we can really like manipulate the area of activation and depression. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question before moving on to the second talk. Amir?
Thank you for the talk. I was curious about the time interval between getting the speech samples and getting the brain imagings.
Mm-hmm.
Were there significant time intervals between them? And the next question is, based on your work with this FTD score that you used, is it consistent over periods of time when you repeat it for an individual?
So we did scans and psychopathology assessments within 48 hours. For most of the subjects, it was on the same day, but not like immediately after the scan. So there is some time lag, but not a lot. And in terms of retest reliability, I'm not so sure actually if that has been tested, but I refer to the Marburg team who invented the scale. But you know, for other for thought disorder rating scales, there has been considerable retest reliability. So I wouldn't question that generally. Maybe yeah, maybe the subjective ones might differ from time frame to time frame.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And so perhaps Frederike, would you like to get started on your presentation?
Yes, thank you. Can everyone see my screen? I guess so. Great. So yeah, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here today to present some findings on transdiagnostic dimensions on formal thought disorder across affective and psychotic patients. So okay, I will just give you a short background on the heterogeneity across psychiatric disorders. As you all know, we use classification systems such as the DSM or ICD to separate disorders into different categories. And what many studies have shown is that this categorical classification is somehow limited as psychiatric disorders are overlapping, for example, regarding brain structure here shown by our team last year, where we identified the left hippocampal volume to be commonly reduced in patients with major depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia spectrum disorders compared to healthy controls. We also see this overlap when looking at genetics, so genes that contribute to the development of both, for example, schizophrenia and depression. And we see also overlaps with regard to environmental risk factors such as childhood maltreatment or pregnancy risk factors. So what comes clear is we see these overlaps, and based on these findings, it's not surprising that studies have failed to identify features that separate disorders from each other. And this is what we see in formal thought disorder as well. We know that formal thought disorder is highly prevalent in schizophrenia, but studies have shown that it's also prevalent in, for example, major depression as well. Here you can see 3 different dimensions and different diagnostic categories. And what comes clear is that some dimensions, for example, disorganization or verbosity, seem to be more prevalent in one disorder than in another, but formal thought disorder is prevalent in affective disorders such as depression as well. And what we see is that up to 53% of patients with depression present with formal thought disorder. Nevertheless, most studies focused on schizophrenia, and this is why I'm here today. I will present 3 studies to you that are based on the 42107 cohort that is located in Marburg and Münster, Germany. This is a longitudinal deep phenotyping study with 3 time points, and at baseline we have currently assessed over 3,000 healthy controls, but also patients with major depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And currently we are working on the 2-year and 5-year follow-up, where all the data you can see here within that table, so psychopathology, neuropsychology, risk factors, protective factors, both structural and functional MRI, as well as general data and biomaterial has been assessed. And as I already said, the 3 studies I will present to you used the data from the baseline data set of that study. So as I said, transdiagnostic studies. I will start with the first one, where we aimed to identify transdiagnostic symptoms dimensions of formal thought disorder. And to identify these dimensions, we used the thought disorder items of the scales for the assessment of negative and positive symptoms in 2 samples with a total N of over 1,000 patients. And with the first sample, we performed an explorative factor analysis, resulting in 3 factors, explaining 50% of total variance. And this model included the factor disorganization, so basically an increase in speech production reflected by symptoms such as derailment or pressure of speech. The second factor, named emptiness, that reflected a decrease in speech production, so presenting negative formal thought disorder, including symptoms such as poverty of speech and content. And then the third factor, incoherence, that included items such as incoherence and illogicality. In the next step, we tried to confirm that model in a confirmatory sample showing good fit values, which can be seen on the right. And we also confirmed the model in the total sample. As you can see on the left, our sample was quite unequally distributed, with the majority of patients with major depression. And to investigate if we could replicate or confirm that model also in a more equally distributed sample, we decided to match the sample based on age and sex with the same N per diagnosis. And again, we were able to confirm our 3 factors with good fit values. So within that first part of the study, we were able to identify and cross-validate a 3-factor model. We could extend existing factor models in schizophrenia, and we were able to show that formal thought disorder is not only a core symptom of schizophrenia, but also prevalent in other disorders, as well as the 3 factors we identified were present in all 3 diagnostic categories, however, with different severity, but which perfectly makes sense. This is something which we would expect, that this organization is more prevalent or severe in schizophrenia than in depression. The next question was, well, maybe this is just a good catch with our 3-factor model. What about models from the literature? How do they perform within our transdiagnostic sample? And therefore, we selected models from the literature and tested them again confirmatorily. And what we saw is that, at least in our transdiagnostic sample, our 3-factor model performed best, which has made us to decide that we will use that model for further analysis. You have seen this just a few minutes ago, but I will briefly explain it again. In the next step, we correlated our transdiagnostic dimensions with gray matter volume. And what came up is that basically the first factor, disorganization, correlated negatively with the left middle occipital gyrus, and our second factor, emptiness, also negatively with the volumes of the left hippocampus and thalamus. Again, the question, what about clinical diagnosis? What about our categorical diagnosis? Would there be any interaction effect? You can see it here on the right as an example. We have our clinical diagnosis, our transdiagnostic factor, and then our identified gray matter volume regions. And what clearly emerges is that basically there's no interaction, which has made us to consider our results as a diagnosis shared relationship between formal thought disorder dimensions and gray matter volume. And these results were also stable when correcting for current medication intake. The next step was to correlate our dimensions with white matter fractional anisotropy. You can see the results here on the left. So the first factor, disorganization, correlated positively with the right posterior cingulum bundle, as well as the right inferior longitudinal bundle, while the third factor, incoherence, correlated negatively with the bilateral anterior thalamic radiation and positively with the hippocampal part of the right cingulum bundle. Again, the question, what about interaction effects with our categorical diagnosis? And again, for all the clusters presented here, this was not the case. So again, no interaction effect. It seemed to be, as we see, a diagnosis shared relationship, also regarding white matter brain structure. And when we look at our results, it became clear that we can replicate or somehow confirm or replicate results we know on former thought disorder in schizophrenia here now, also in a transdiagnostic sample across patients with affective and psychotic disorders. I will now come to the second study. So now, as we know, transdiagnostic dimensions and also associations to single brain structures, we were wondering if we could find also associations to the brain structural network, so the connectome. And within that approach, we combined both gray and white matter brain structure and performed network analyses. And this approach corresponds to the assumption that cognitive functions, including obviously language and speech and the behavioral measures of former thought disorder, arise less from individual brain regions, but rather from a network of interacting brain areas. And what we did is that we firstly correlated our factors that were published last year in Schizophrenia Bulletin with global connectome measures, for example, with the total number of streamlines. But even more interesting, we were able to identify transdiagnostic subnetworks within the structural connectome. And what you can see here is that we identified a subnetwork for the disorganization dimension that is mainly distributed by temporal regions, with the left middle temporal gyrus as one of the major hubs. So a major hub within the network is a hub that is most important, and it is mostly connected to other hubs or nodes. And what emerges as well is that it's a bilateral network. So it's not just the left hemisphere, but also the right one. And again, the question was, what about an interaction effect, or what about an effect of our categorical diagnosis? And again, we performed the same classical interaction analyses, resulting in no results, as you can see here, so no interaction effect. And then in the next step, we also performed more comprehensive interaction analysis to investigate a potential effect using bootstrapped confidence intervals and also Bayesian analyses of covariance. And again, we did not find any hints of an effect of categorical diagnosis. So for the first time here, we can show a transdiagnostic subnetwork for this organization across patients with major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. And this subnetwork was also stable when correcting for current medication and also disease severity. The next step was to look at our emptiness dimension. And again, we were able to identify a subnetwork. This subnetwork was mainly distributed by frontal regions, but also by temporal regions, with the left insula and left precentral gyrus as one of the major hubs. And again, we did not find any interaction effects. And again, these results remained stable when correcting for medication and disease severity. This was, until now, really explorative again. And we were wondering, what about if we could confirm results from studies on former thought disorder and schizophrenia here as well? And what we did is we looked into the literature and identified regions that were previously consistently reported in schizophrenia regarding former thought disorder. And based on this research, we identified 24 regions and investigated if these 24 regions would overlap with our identified subnetworks. And what you can see here on the left is our disorganization subnetwork. This one consisted of 47 nodes. And then we looked at how many of the 24 regions from the literature would overlap with these 47 nodes in our network. And from the 24, 18 overlapped. And also when comparing this to just any random network, it remained significant. So we see a clear overlap, and this was also true for the emptiness subnetwork here with 64 nodes. And again, 18 overlapped here in yellow. And what you see is that it's not the same 18 nodes that overlap. Some are same, but not all. So again, a confirmation that we see somehow the same results or comparable results here in a transdiagnostic sample, also to the literature in schizophrenia. This is the third and last study I want to present to you. So now, as we know the dimensions and also brain structure correlates, we were wondering if we could identify subtypes of formal thought disorder. So when we use factor analyses, we can group variables and identify dimensions. But with this approach, we were able to group patients based on symptoms, which is somehow more close to the clinical reality we see it every day in practice. So this has been done already before, once for formal thought disorder, but in schizophrenia, for example, to identify cognitive subtypes, or in depression to identify depressive subtypes. And here we use that approach for formal thought disorder. There's one study published on that, I think last year, from a group in Munich, from the Brunia study, where they tried to identify subtypes of formal thought disorder in recent onset psychosis, and there they identified two types, basically low and high formal thought disorder. And here now the question, can we identify transdiagnostic types? And therefore we used clustering techniques and tested different models, including 2 to 5 subtypes. And based on the fit values here, we decided that a model with 4 subtypes would be best suited for our data. And as we hypothesized, we found transdiagnostic subtypes. So here we have our 4 subtypes: minimal, poverty, inhibition, and severe. And what we see is that within each subtype, we find patients from each diagnostic categories. However, within the severe type, most schizophrenia spectrum disorder patients were included, which again makes sense, but also patients with depression. And to briefly characterize these subtypes, we have here the first subtype, minimal, in red. These patients in this subtype did not show any formal thought disorder or only subclinical formal thought disorder, while the second type, poverty, can be characterized by specifically increased latency of response and a decrease in speech production, so reflected by poverty of speech and poverty of content. Looking at the third subtype, inhibition, we found that this type can be characterized by slowed and inhibited speech with specifically retardation. And the fourth, the last type, the severe type, can be characterized by severe formal thought disorder in all domains or symptoms, however, with a tendency towards positive thought disorder. And we also compared these types not only in our indicator variables, but also with regard to cognitive functioning. And what came up is that basically type 2 and 3, so poverty and inhibition, differed in their cognitive functioning. So the poverty type and also the severe type performed worst in all cognitive domains we've tested compared to the other 2 subtypes. For example, in working memory, but also verbal fluency and executive functioning. And obviously the next step was to see, well, do we see differences in brain structure across these types? And therefore we tested at first grammar to volume, but also surface measures that were all derived from the CAT-12 toolbox, including cortical thickness, gyrification, sulcal depth, and cortical complexity. And basically what we found is that the minimal compared to the severe type differed in the right superior frontal gyrus, while the inhibition type compared to both the minimal and severe type showed an increase of grammar to volume in the right middle and temporal gyri. We did not find any results for cortical thickness and gyrification, but for sulcal depth. And here we found that the inhibition type showed increased sulcal depth in the left insula compared to the poverty type, which can be seen here. And when we compare this inhibition type to the severe type, we also see this increase of sulcal depth bilaterally in the insula. And again, here the question was, what about an interaction? So what about our diagnostic categories? Is this diagnosis shared? And what we see is that, again, interaction analyses show no results. So again, we would assume that we see a diagnosis shared relationship. Yeah, and this is this means that while we see this diagnosis relationship, it's not necessarily necessary that the alteration is the same in patients with schizophrenia and depression. So it's diagnosis shared, but the level of alteration might be different. And to summarize the 3 studies I've just shown within the last minutes to you, we can say that we were able to identify a transdiagnostic model of former thought disorder that confirms the assumption about the prevalence of former thought disorders beyond psychotic disorders, so also in major depression and bipolar disorder. Our results provide first evidence of common neuroanatomical structures that are involved in affective and psychotic disorders, and these results perfectly or partly at least map to the results we just saw a few minutes ago. And finally, data-driven approaches as employed in the present studies can provide a valuable insight into the clinical co-occurrence of different psychopathologies and may therefore assist in the establishment of treatment of syndrome-specific treatments. And with that, I want to close. I want to thank my colleagues from the 42107 cohort in Marburg and Münster, Germany, specifically my supervisor, Thilo Kircher. Thank you for your attention. I'm really happy to answer your questions now, or also feel free to contact me afterwards whenever you have any questions regarding the analysis and data I've just presented to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will lead with a question, if I may, while everyone's collecting their thoughts. I just had a little bit of a clarification, I guess. So you showed in the analysis of identifying subnetworks that associated with disorganization as well as emptiness, it looked like there was a negative, it looked like there was a negative relationship. So does that mean that the networks were less coherent, or maybe that's not the right, that's a confusing term to use in this context, but the networks were less well connected when there were greater amounts of speech symptoms?
So in other words, when having high disorganization or a lot of form of thought disorder, disconnectivity decreases. Connectivity decreases, so we have disconnectivity.
I see, yeah. So the networks are almost more, perhaps, could also be thought of as being organization and productivity networks based on their functioning. Okay, fascinating. Yeah. Manu?
Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Just thinking through some of the findings, it sounds like, do you feel that if we kind of follow through on these samples, we'll be able to further think through the limitations of DSM-based categories for predicting treatment response or brain organizations or neurobiological underpinnings, and even see differences in the way they respond to treatment, thinking through like having formal thought disorders or disruptions in brain organization, which kind of present themselves as thought disorder, being like specific subphenotypes within the presentation of the psychiatric illness itself, warranting different types of treatment?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, obviously we see different types and we need different treatments. And I think the first step now would be somehow to maybe have a closer look and on these subtypes we saw in the last study, and also identify maybe subtypes not only based on formal thought disorder ratings as we did here, but also based on spontaneous speech data, which is somehow more informative, and then see if we can also replicate these subtypes maybe, and then the next step would be to establish these treatments. Yeah, and I think it's not just only formal thought disorder, it's also in general psychopathology. So you will have patients with depression, with hallucinations, and the other way around, in schizophrenia you have depression as well. And I think this is something that is not acknowledged in our current classification system, or at least in our in the studies that compare just groups.
Yeah, thank you. Lena?
Thanks, Sunny. Thank you, Frederike. This was an excellent talk. And you have one of the rarest data sets, like large transdiagnostic group with imaging as well. So it's excellent to hear many pieces of work that's being done. I had a comment and a question as well. The comment is on, well, there's several points in your presentation that made me think how useful it is to collect transdiagnostic data. First of all, the role of structures like insula in formal thought disorder. The very early work that you showed, Sebastian, Helge Hahn's work on CBF, actually pointed to insula, but many later studies were really chasing only the language system. And it's very interesting to see how your cluster analysis is showing some of the developmental structural issues to pointing us back to insula in some sense. And I think that's something to follow up as well. On that note, I wanted to ask you, what is the difference phenomenologically between the inhibition cluster and the poverty cluster? Because overlap, what would that group show? Do you have any explanations for that?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Professor Kircher and I were discussing this a lot. And I think, well, the limitation is the use of different scales that are somehow specific to one disorder. So we used items of Young Mania Rating Scale of SANS, and also Hamilton Depression Scale. And within the Hamilton Depression Scale, there's one item reflecting retardation and slowed speech and thinking. And this item was increased within the inhibition cluster. And this was just the only difference between the poverty and inhibition type. So we thought this item and the difference in the brain, and also differences in cognitive functioning. And I think that the major limitation is that the assessment we use, the scales we use, are somehow designed for one categorical diagnosis. And therefore, it's really difficult to identify also transdiagnostic dimensions or subtypes when we always rely on scales that were designed for example, schizophrenia or depression. And I think maybe this is just a bias we had when collecting the data, or we collect something different, maybe. This is still open. Yeah.
Just wanted to add that we, so in our paper that was published in the same special issue, which will go into more detail later on in the fall, we also we use the TLC, which is a different scale, but from the same author, Nancy Andreasen, and we added 2 items from the SANS about latency and decreased prosody, decreased vocal inflections. And when we found similar findings in terms of being able to find cross-diagnostic dimensions and effects, so that I feel like this is a reproducible finding.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Mechanistically, I was thinking, mechanistically speaking, does inhibition relate to processing speed deficits? And the other problem that you mentioned, poverty, relates to something completely different. I don't know if you have enough data, but that's something that we can pursue, I guess. When you cluster people in this way, you can pursue mechanistically what computations underlie these clusters sometimes.
Yeah, thank you.
Sebastian?
Yeah, again, it was an excellent talk. I want to echo the others. Very exciting data, and there's a lot of things that can be learned from the transdiagnostic perspective. But I guess you could probably also look at the distribution within just one subset, as you mentioned. Some of the rating scales are designed for just a specific category, and I think it would be worth to also explore those components only in the psychotic patients, and see whether this is the same pattern or whether you get different associations.
Good catch. Actually, this is, thank you so much. This is actually what I've been doing the last 2 weeks. As every time we submit a paper, reviewers asking, what about patients with depression? How does it look in schizophrenia? And we decided to investigate these disorders separately and looked, well, when we just look at one disorder, do we find the same? And it's not the same, but it's almost the same. So it seems to be comparable, but we should really keep in mind that the severity is different. So we have more form of thought disorder in schizophrenia patients, and we also have more alterations than in depression, for example. But yeah, this is something I'm currently working on, and yeah, I hope to present these results soon somewhere.
So the inhibition is the similar inhibition in schizophrenia and in the depressed.
I think we haven't tested the inhibition type yet, but we will. Thank you.
Alban?
Yeah, I want to thank you both for your presentations, and there's an overarching question as well. I noticed that you both mentioned having functional data as well, where they had the impression that most of these networks were on structural data. And we know if medication is given, these form of thought disorders can respond quite well, or at least the positive form of thought disorders. So what do you think of the timescale here? Is it more of a structural thing? Why do we see it in structural data as well, when it seems to be, I would expect it to be more driven by functional disconnectivity in some way?
Should I start, or do you want? Okay. This is a question we have to answer with longitudinal data, actually, I think. And at least in Marburg, we haven't looked at the functional data yet, because we have like only resting state data, and our task-based functional data is not related to language. But yeah, I would assume that it is somehow a alteration in structural data that outlasts symptoms. So symptoms may be more fluent and change over time, but the alteration remains. But this is just a hypothesis we have to test, basically.
With us, it's the same. We just haven't looked at the resting state bold data yet. But you could take a proxy in the cerebral blood flow at rest, because that should change also with symptoms. And here we see an association with the total health and with objective positive, but not with the other ones. So there might be some dimensions that are more related to state fluctuations, and the others are being, say, more time enduring, let's say, not talking trait, but maybe like states that last for longer periods of time.
I think that makes sense. Sorry, yeah, I was just going to quickly add that I feel like that makes sense from a clinical perspective, because I feel like clinically we observe positive thought disorder symptoms as maybe possibly fluctuating more than negative type symptoms. So Amélie?
Yeah, so I guess it's the perfect link, because I was going to ask about like the fluctuating aspect of like symptoms, but in relation, like when I see relationship with like structural, like you could imagine that there's a certain malleability of the brain regions, that like if you still see like structural correlations with something that's like fluctuating, that like it's and like the idea that there's the longitudinal data coming, I think it's going to be very interesting for that. So like it was not really a question, but like sort of like wanting to hear you about like how do you think of like those like relationship between something that's more highly fluctuating, like the symptoms, and the structure of the brain that's likely fluctuating like less quickly.
Yeah, I mean, this is, thank you. This is something we really have to test using our longitudinal data set, because I think at that moment we can speculate what might be true or not. But yeah, using the longitudinal data, we will hopefully get an answer on that. But yeah, as I said, I would really think that, yeah, it's a limitation, obviously. This is something we can resolve, and maybe it's the case that we have these brain regions not being that fluctuate, but outlast the fluctuations within the symptoms. Yeah.
And I don't know if I can ask a second question. Yeah, I really enjoy today's talk. I missed the beginning of Sebastian's presentation. I'm sorry about that, but I was like wondering, like, and at least in the second presentation, the battery of like test was like quite comprehensive, and like for people like who get tired easily, like if like people with cognitive deficit, I was wondering if that like, so because more likely to bring about the formal thought disorder symptoms when people get more tired from a comprehensive battery. I don't know if it was the same in Sebastian's study, but like so like what's the time, like when you assess formal thought disorder, is it based on like the full observation of like the beginning till the end of like that, like the testing sessions, or like, I don't know if I'm being clear, but like, so like, if you see like people, let's say people had like a little bit less symptoms at the beginning, but as they get more tired, like, do you rate the worst of it, or like?
So what we did was the TALT ratings based on expert ratings, and it's the patients run through a long battery of rating scales and questionnaires, so they're engaging with us for 3 to 4 hours sometimes. So we get symptoms when people are tired as well. So I guess we might be more sensitive here because it's so long. But this is an interesting question that also relates to the brain imaging findings. You could also think about like triggering people in the scanner for having them do some task and see if they get worse over time. That would be also an interesting let's say interesting way of testing formal thought disorders. Yeah.
Thank you.
Manu?
Just one previous comment got me thinking, and I don't think the sample size may be big enough to test this, but do we feel that the kind of psychotropic medications a person is on will also influence, because SSRIs will have different profiles as compared to antipsychotics as to how they affect brain functioning, like if they play a role in the transdiagnostic dimensions, to like the different subpopulations that you found some way, because SSRIs will have some inhibitory action as well, so antipsychotics will have a completely different one, and the inherent pathophysiological disturbances in psychosis is like inhibitory, depression, maybe something else, but like how do you kind of account for all that messiness in a way?
Thank you. So in the present studies I've presented to you, we included 3 covariates accounting for antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers. And at least here, these covariates did not change the results, but this is really, I mean, not very detailed. the biggest problem is that when you have transdiagnostic samples, you have the problem that medication is also related to your diagnostic categories. And when you add a different variable that is really close related to your diagnostic categories, you won't see any effects because the diagnoses are related to the symptoms. And then this is somehow a circle you're not able to leave. I remember my first publication where we also had symptom dimensions, but more globally on general psychopathology. And there we correlated different types of medication. And what I remember is that at least for formal thought disorder, there were no correlations, but this is a really good thought. I mean, medication is really important, and it would be really interesting to see if we see differential effects of different types of medication. Yeah, but the limitation then is that we only have the current medication and not the lifetime medication of this data set. So we don't know if the patient 2 weeks before did take lithium or whatever. So yeah, this is again also limited, but really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, and just wanted to add, my group is actually presenting a poster at SIRS this year where we took just a small view of that question. So we looked at how symptoms, psychosis, just in schizophrenia, how psychosis symptoms impacted speech, and then separately how medications impacted speech through extrapyramidal side effects. So, and how medications were then related also to the symptoms as well. So we found like the direct effects of medications related to symptoms and medications related to extrapyramidal side effects, but there was no effect through, there's no mediation through extrapyramidal side effects on speech symptoms. So at least in our analysis there. So it's doesn't answer the question fully, but maybe some of it. Lena?
I'll keep it
Still
brief.
muted.
Yes, okay. Can you hear me? Right. The follow-up on the medication issue, very brief plug-in for Jana Diebert's paper on D2 blockers, D2 blocking severity and relationship with NLP variables. It's out there in schizophrenia, I think, if you can look at it. That's a very interesting paper. The second thing is Emily's question on mental state examination. How long do you do it to elicit thought and language disturbances? I think, we think of this as a sign, but we don't have good answer for how to elicit that sign. It's a reflex, but what do you do to elicit the reflex? And in the past, the traditional teaching has been talk to the patient long enough until you get an idea of disorganization. But it's very hard to do that in research settings, and tiredness, fatigue, these are important variables. Now, this may be a chance to give a little plug-in for what we're trying to do in Discourse. With Sunny, with Eric Tan, and then myself, we had a request from Tila Kircher to see if we can set up some training program for TALD online for global use. And we had an early discussion, and we thought, can we make a set of questions that actually taps TLC, TALD, and everything, all these scales, rating scales out there, and use that as a interview prompts for eliciting TLC, TLI metrics in the future. We're still thinking about it. If someone else wants to contribute to it, you're very welcome, but early days. But this question seems open. How long do we have to do it? What question will really elicit disorganization? And we cannot keep interviewing for 1 hour. That's not going to work for most patients.
I see Amelie's hand up. I don't know, and Amir's was up as well. Were you responding to what Lena was saying? So go ahead.
Sorry, just opening my microphone. Yeah, I just wanted to add that maybe the one thing that could be relevant there for the elicitation aspect is the emotional reactivity of speech. The idea that you get a little bit more of that disorganization when people speak about something that's more emotional. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Amir?
Again, thank you for the talks, both of you. It was great. It's actually a question that I'm also dealing with it when I'm trying to work with our data. So perhaps it's a question to the field that everyone can contribute on it. When Frederike was like showing the distribution of TALD versus brain brain connectivity features, or for example, when I'm working with NLP features against some dimensional measurements that we have, what I can see is that for those who do not have any symptom dimension, we see a great degree of variability. So if we convert everything, for example, to z-scores, for those who score 0, we have a huge degree of variability, and as we diverge from 0, we can see that everything it has a more clear pattern. The question, which is perhaps more of a methodological question, is that to what degree the distribution of people without any symptom is actually driving the linear regressions that we are capturing and reporting. So any thoughts to how to deal with it? Should we exclude those without any a specific symptom dimension that we are trying to explore? Should we exclude those from further analysis to see the pure effects? Or, I mean, help me with this. So, because I'm also dealing with it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sebastian. I have a thought.
I have my favorite thought on this is the rating scales will always have that problem. You know, you always have people that have no symptoms, no matter what you are examining, and that's why I'm so much a fan of using like objective markers. In motor, you have actigraphy, or you can use speech samples where you can have you can calculate something, and then you have very little people, or very few people who have actually 0. Many have something close to 0, but then you get variance, and then you can have a better estimation. I think the rating scales are just something that helps us approach the problem a little bit. But if we really want to understand it, we need to go more into studying biology more directly, or the behavior more directly.
Yeah, I agree, Sebastian. I just wanted to add this problem is not new. It's kind of historically, every rating scale you use, do you categorize people into TD plus, TD minus, and compare the groups, who has thought disorder, who doesn't, or do you have a dimensional relationship? There are pros and cons with both, but one thing I would say is the dimensions, the continuous variability. We think that sometimes we assume, without looking at the data, we assume the continuity has similar quality across different dimensions and different symptoms, but it is not. For example, if you look at tangentiality, it is how often tangentiality was shown in 1 hour of interview. If you look at poverty of speech, how many words were spoken? Sometimes it's about frequency, sometimes about intensity, sometimes about just having something seen is rated. So these are not same across different items, and that is a consideration to think about as well. In the recent work that Philip Homan and I put out in Schizophrenia Bulletin, reviewing language network, we do touch upon this issue, and it is not trivial when we consider formal thought disorder.
Thank you. I just wanted to note that we've reached 10:30, but we still have 2 people with their hands up. I don't know if the speakers are able to stay on for a couple minutes, and we'll let people, drift off as they need to leave. All right, Samir.
Hi, I'm kind of the black sheep in this group, I guess. Not quite black sheep, but language sheep, I guess. I come from the language side of things, and one of the things that language understanding folks learned after a long debate was, unless you have consistency in measurement in terms of annotations, you cannot expect algorithms to get better. And the point I'm trying to make here is that one thing that has been coming up again and again in me, and I haven't quite gotten a good handle on it, is how these measures relate to how can we get this more consistently, in the sense that when you say there is tangentiality, we don't really know exactly what part of the dialogue or the speech is actually tangentiality. There's the gross it's a core, the measurements are somewhat more coarser than it could be useful, and so I think it will be very interesting to figure out if you can integrate them a little bit more into the signal, so that you can actually, rather than having these wonderful transformers figure it out for us. I mean, it would be great if that, they do that, but there's not enough data, going to feed enough data. But if we can actually identify these and somewhat consistently, I think it could be really, we could build tools that could consistently get it back. And so there will be some sense of, I mean, on the other hand, I forgot the name of the other, Sebastian, I think, said that there is infinite variability. And if you can get stuck into the nuances, and if you go in the nuances, there are so many nuances, you will not find the signal at all. So there is this trade-off between how much nuanced versus how much signal that you can use for training algorithms or methods. Sorry, I hope I got the point through.
Thank you for that point. Yeah, I think just echoing the need to make sure that they're measuring the underlying constructs in a reliable and valid way as well. Laura?
So I think my question kind of relates to what Samir and Amir has been mentioning about, and what I see is, I guess for research purpose, we measure these thought disorders and speech disorders by looking at how much tangentiality is there, disorganized speech, the level of disorganized speech. But it appears to me that when we compare, we just like collect this large amount of data from many different people. What we are doing is individual people have their own cognitive capacity, their own ability to speak. They have their own inherent speech errors, and then that's affected by their emotional state, fatigue, concentration. So it fluctuates. And then also we are like, we don't know what we are looking at, whether we are looking at this person's static capacity limitations, or are we looking at a disease state, an episode of psychosis. It appears to me, Samir mentioned about, there is this challenge of getting data, but I feel like what we really need is, if we want to detect whether somebody is entering a psychotic episode or getting worse, what we need is, we already need individual data from a particular person when they're doing well, and then we need to track it like over time, and then we need to compare it to the change in that individual, which will be impossible to without having some kind of a wearable device that constantly track the person. I understand there'll be like huge research barrier to this, but basically we need to process a lot more data and compare this data based on individual person and fluctuation within that person's capacity, not like just comparing individual person from here and there, and then try to see whether there's some kind of problem occurring. I don't know whether that makes sense, but that's a thought that's coming up to be like, we need like some kind of wearable device and really need a lot of data.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. Thank you so much. Actually, this morning we had a meeting on a new project we proposed where we use momentary assessments and ask people to also record their speech, I think once a day, and it's over 4 weeks or something like that. And then we try to investigate dynamic networks and also the changes in these 4 weeks to establish person-specific treatments, because if we don't do that, we won't get there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Samir, do you have a quick comment? We should probably wrap.
Oh, sorry, I should lower my hand. I should lower my hand.
Oh, it's just there. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for sticking with us, for joining. We had some excellent talks and presentations. So this is recorded as well, so for anyone who missed part of it and wants to hear more. Our next seminar will be on the 24th at the same time, and we'll be hearing from Caroline Netkoven. All right, so we'll hopefully see you then.
Does anyone know when the Schizophrenia Bulletin special issue will be released?
Yes.
We're just reading the proof of the final set this week. It should have been come yesterday, but the delay in production. It should be online next week, hopefully.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining. It was really fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.